Foul's not called. And then Cunningham gets into the...
They intentionally came out to get her across the neck like she did, but it did happen, and I thought it was the right call. But, you know, one of the things about Nay is that she's going to play her butt off, man.
Say I am so fucking sick of the Indiana Fever and Sophie Cunningham. I really, really mean it, and I really have been trying to just keep my mouth shut because the rabid-ass, racist-ass fan base makes it insufferable to actually talk about basketball with people, one, who know the game, who used to play the game, and understand sometimes things just happen in the game. Dijonai got ejected in the first quarter in the Chicago Sky versus Indiana Fever. Sophie Cunningham.
Dijonai Carrington just said she took my spot and went completely off after Reebok signed a huge deal with Sophie Cunningham, and the basketball world is processing those 4 words with the same analytical intensity the basketball world processed Clark's 4 words when she said, "If she goes, I go because she took my spot," is not simply a frustrated athlete's reaction to a commercial development she finds personally unwelcome. It is an institutional statement of commercial self-understanding, whose specific content reveals more about how Carrington is processing the full commercial accountability weight of everything the governance accountability season's most consequential disciplinary and organizational decisions have produced in their most commercially personal and most market-specifically concentrated form than any other communication she has made across the entire arc of the accountability story's most dramatic chapters. She took my spot, 4 words, and the basketball world cannot stop talking about them because the specific commercial and institutional claim those 4 words make is simultaneously the most personally revealing and the most commercially analytically significant individual communication the governance accountability story has produced from the individual at the center of its most consequential disciplinary and commercial accountability developments. Today, I am breaking down exactly what "she took my spot" means as a commercial and institutional claim, why the specific content of that claim reveals something fundamentally important about how Carrington is understanding her own position in the commercial accountability story the governance accountability season has built, what Reebok signing a huge deal with Cunningham means for the commercial ecosystem of women's basketball's most commercially significant era, why the "she took my spot" framing is analytically significant in ways that go beyond the immediate drama of a frustrated individual's commercial reaction, and what the entire "she took my spot" communication tells you about the specific commercial and governance accountability dynamics the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season has been building toward in its most commercially concentrated and its most personally specific individual expression. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific analytical dimension of the "she took my spot" claim that every outlet covering the story has been treating as the emotional backdrop of a dramatic commercial story, when it is actually the most institutionally revealing element of the entire "she took my spot" communication, and the one that changes how the commercial accountability transformation the Reebok and Cunningham deal most specifically represents, needs to be understood in the full context of everything the governance accountability season has built. She took my spot. The specific choice of those 4 words and their specific commercial and institutional framing is the most analytically significant element of Carrington's going off after the Reebok deal with Cunningham, and understanding why requires engaging with the specific commercial accountability claim the words most precisely make, rather than the emotional frustration they most naturally appear to express. The "she took" framing attributes Cunningham's commercial opportunity to Cunningham's specific action rather than to the governance accountability decisions and commercial market consequences that the analytical framework most accurately describes as the mechanism through which the commercial space the Reebok deal occupies was created and subsequently filled. The "my spot" framing claims a specific commercial entitlement to the athletic footwear commercial relationship the Reebok deal represents, that the commercial accountability mechanism through which Cunningham has received the Reebok offer most directly challenges through the specific commercial validation it provides. Together, "she took my spot" is the commercial and institutional claim of an individual who is processing the Reebok deal with Cunningham as a personal commercial displacement action by Cunningham, rather than as the commercial market's most appropriate and most governance accountability validated response to the governance-driven commercial vacancy the governance accountability season's most consequential disciplinary decisions have produced. That specific processing of the commercial accountability mechanism through the "she took my spot" framing is the most analytically revealing element of the "she took my spot" communication because it establishes with the most personal and the most commercially specific clarity available how Carrington understands her own role in the commercial accountability story the governance accountability season has built. And the understanding the framing reveals is the analytical foundation of everything the "she took my spot" communication most specifically tells you about the commercial and institutional dynamics of the Clark era's most commercially concentrated and most personally specific individual accountability chapter. Let us start with the commercial reality of what the Reebok deal with Cunningham actually represents, because the accurate commercial characterization of the deal is the analytical foundation that makes the "she took my spot" framing most analytically revealing in its specific commercial inaccuracy, and what that inaccuracy most specifically tells you about Carrington's commercial self-understanding in the accountability context the governance accountability season has produced. Reebok's deal with Cunningham, as we established in the previous video covering the initial offer and Carrington's first losing it reaction, is a commercial market response to the governance-driven commercial vacancy the official ban and franchise firing have created in the athletic footwear commercial landscape. Filled through a commercial offer to the most commercially credible and the most governance accountability validated available alternative in the specific competitive and commercial context the governance accountability season has produced. The commercial characterization of the deal as the most governance accountability validated commercial market response to a governance-driven commercial vacancy is the analytically accurate description of the mechanism through which the commercial space the Reebok deal occupies was created and subsequently filled. And that accurate characterization is the commercial reality against which the "she took my spot" framing most specifically and most analytically revealingly fails to account for the governance accountability mechanism that is the actual commercial causal agent of the commercial displacement Carrington is experiencing. Cunningham did not take Carrington's spot in the commercial sense. The "she took my spot" framing most naturally claims. The governance accountability decisions and the commercial market's most appropriate response to those decisions together created the commercial space the Reebok deal with Cunningham fills through the specific commercial mechanism that the "she took my spot" framing attributes to Cunningham's personal commercial action, rather than to the governance accountability mechanism most accurately describing how the commercial displacement was produced. The analytical significance of that specific commercial mischaracterization in the "she took my spot" framing is the most institutionally revealing element of the entire "she took my spot" communication. Now let us talk about what the Reebok deal with Cunningham specifically represents as a commercial development, because the magnitude and the commercial significance of the deal are the analytical foundation for understanding why Carrington going off about it produces the "she took my spot" communication rather than the more measured commercial acknowledgement that a less commercially significant deal would most naturally produce from even the most frustrated individual processing a personal commercial displacement in the most publicly documented form. Reebok signing a huge deal with Cunningham is not simply the commercial consequence of a governance-driven competitive ecosystem change. It is the formal commercial market establishment of Cunningham as a major athletic footwear brand partner at the level that the Adidas relationship and the Jordan brand combined deal with Clark have already established her individual commercial standing as among the most commercially significant in women's basketball's most commercially significant era. The addition of a Reebok commercial relationship to the Adidas relationship and the Jordan brand combined deal creates what is potentially the most commercially documented individual athletic footwear brand presence in women's basketball's most commercially significant era, with three distinct major athletic footwear brand relationships simultaneously validating Cunningham's individual commercial standing through the most commercially specific and the most market-directly documented forms of commercial validation available to the athletic footwear commercial market. The specific commercial magnitude of the Reebok deal relative to the commercial vacancy the governance-driven departure has created is the commercial accountability dimension that makes Carrington going off about the deal the most commercially concentrated individual governance accountability reaction. The Clark era's most dramatically commercially significant governance accountability chapter has produced. Now let us talk about the She Took My Spot framing's analytical significance, because this is the most institutionally revealing layer of the entire She Took My Spot communication, and the one that the mainstream coverage is treating as the emotional expression of commercial frustration, when it is actually the most specific and the most commercially precise available indicator of how Carrington understands her own position in the commercial accountability story the governance accountability season has built. The She Took framing is analytically significant because it assigns commercial agency to Cunningham for the commercial displacement, rather than to the governance accountability mechanism through which the commercial vacancy was created and subsequently filled. This specific assignment of commercial agency is the analytical reveal because it establishes that Carrington is processing the commercial accountability consequences of the governance accountability season's most consequential disciplinary decisions through a personal displacement framework rather than a governance accountability consequence framework. The difference between those two processing frameworks is the most analytically important institutional distinction the She Took My Spot communication produces. Because the personal displacement framework attributes the commercial consequence to Cunningham's competitive and commercial conduct, rather than to Carrington's own conduct and its governance accountability consequences. While the governance accountability consequence framework attributes the commercial consequence to the governance accountability mechanism through which Carrington's own conduct produced the governance decisions whose commercial consequences the Reebok deal with Cunningham most specifically and most commercially directly represents. The My Spot framing is analytically significant because it claims a commercial entitlement to the athletic footwear commercial relationship the Reebok deal represents, that the governance accountability mechanism through which the commercial space was created most directly challenges. A spot in the athletic footwear commercial market is not a permanent entitlement that persists through governance-driven competitive ecosystem departures regardless of the conduct and governance decisions that produced the departure. It is a commercial relationship whose continuation depends on the specific commercial value the partner provides within the competitive and commercial ecosystem where the commercial relationship operates, and the governance-driven departure from that ecosystem through the official ban and franchise firing is the specific commercial consequence of the governance decisions whose commercial accountability the Reebok deal with Cunningham most commercially directly represents. The She Took My Spot framing's attribution of the commercial displacement to Cunningham's personal action, rather than to the governance accountability mechanism, most accurately describing the commercial displacement mechanism, is therefore the most analytically revealing commercial self-understanding the She Took My Spot communication exposes. Now let us zoom all the way out, because Carrington going off after Reebok signs a huge deal with Cunningham and saying she took my spot is the commercial accountability event that most specifically and most analytically, revealingly personalizes the commercial dimension of the governance accountability transformation in the individual self-understanding of the specific individual at the center of its most consequential disciplinary and commercial accountability developments. The governance accountability season has been producing institutional, disciplinary, and organizational accountability developments, whose commercial implications we have analyzed through the governance accountability framework that most accurately describes the mechanisms through which the institutional and disciplinary decisions have produced their most commercially direct and most commercially specific consequences. The She Took My Spot communication is the individual commercial self-understanding of the person most directly experiencing those commercial accountability consequences in the most personally concentrated form, and the specific analytical difference between the governance accountability mechanism the analytical framework most accurately describes and the personal displacement framework the She Took My Spot communication most specifically expresses is the most analytically revealing institutional contrast the She Took My Spot communication produces between the accurate commercial accountability characterization of the Reebok deal and the commercial self-understanding of the individual experiencing its most personally concentrated commercial consequence. That analytical contrast is the most institutionally revealing element of the entire She Took My Spot story, because it establishes with the most personal and the most commercially specific clarity available how the individual most directly experiencing the governance accountability transformation's most commercially concentrated consequences is understanding those consequences in a framework that attributes them to the competitive and commercial conduct of the most governance accountability validated available alternative in the governance-driven commercial vacancy, rather than to the governance accountability mechanism through which the commercial displacement was most accurately produced. Remember the most institutionally revealing element of the "she took my spot" communication? Here it is. The specific commercial agency attribution in the "she took" framing is simultaneously the most emotionally understandable and the most analytically revealing element of the entire "she took my spot" communication, because it represents the specific psychological processing mechanism through which individuals most naturally manage the experience of commercial accountability, arriving in its most personally concentrated commercial form. Attributing the commercial displacement to the competitive and commercial conduct of the most governance accountability validated available alternative, rather than to their own conduct and its governance accountability consequences in the specific commercial accountability mechanism, most accurately describing how the Reebok deal with Cunningham was produced. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the "she took my spot" communication, and why it matters beyond the immediate commercial drama of an individual going off about a brand deal. The specific commercial accountability processing mechanism the "she took my spot" framing reveals is the most analytically important institutional element of the entire story, because it establishes the specific way in which the personal displacement framework most naturally processes commercial accountability consequences in the most personally concentrated commercial form. And that processing mechanism is the most practically applicable analytical insight the "she took my spot" communication produces for understanding how governance accountability transformations are experienced in their most personally concentrated commercial dimensions by the individuals most directly affected by their most commercially consequential developments. The governance accountability story has been analyzed primarily through the institutional and governance frameworks that most accurately describe the mechanisms through which the accountability season's most consequential disciplinary decisions have produced their most commercially direct and most commercially specific consequences. But the "she took my spot" communication reveals that the individuals experiencing those commercial accountability consequences in their most personally concentrated form process them through the personal displacement framework rather than the governance accountability mechanism framework. And understanding that processing difference is the most analytically important insight, the "she took my spot" communication contributes to the complete picture of how the governance accountability transformation is experienced in its most personally concentrated commercial dimension by the individuals most directly at the center of its most consequential developments. The second hidden angle is the specific commercial accountability lesson. The "she took my spot" framing teaches about how communication around commercial accountability developments needs to be structured to most accurately engage with the governance accountability mechanism, producing the commercial displacement rather than the personal displacement framework, most naturally processing it. Because the difference between those two communicative frameworks is the most analytically important commercial accountability communication distinction, the "she took my spot" communication, most specifically and most analytically revealingly produces. My verdict on Carrington going off after Reebok signs a huge deal with Cunningham and saying "she took my spot" is this: stated directly and with the full analytical complexity, the institutional and commercial significance of the "she took my spot" communication most urgently requires. Dijonai Carrington, going off after Reebok, signs a huge deal with Sophie Cunningham and saying "she took my spot" is the most analytically revealing individual commercial accountability communication the Clark era's governance accountability story has produced, because the specific "she took my spot" framing is simultaneously the most emotionally understandable personal displacement processing of commercial accountability consequences, arriving in their most personally concentrated form, and the most analytically revealing institutional contrast between the accurate commercial accountability mechanism the governance accountability framework most precisely describes, and the personal displacement framework through which commercial accountability consequences are most naturally processed when they arrive in their most personally concentrated individual form. The first reason this verdict is correct is the commercial agency attribution dimension. The specific assignment of commercial agency to Cunningham for the commercial displacement rather than to the governance accountability mechanism through which the commercial vacancy was created and subsequently filled, is the most analytically revealing element of the "she took my spot" communication because it establishes the specific psychological processing framework through which the individual most directly experiencing the governance accountability transformation's most commercially concentrated consequences is understanding those consequences in a framework that most naturally personalizes rather than most accurately characterizes the commercial accountability mechanism producing them. The second reason is the commercial entitlement claim dimension. The My Spot framing's claim of commercial entitlement to the athletic footwear commercial relationship the Reebok deal represents is the most commercially specific indicator of how the personal displacement framework processes commercial accountability consequences, attributing the commercial displacement to the competitive and commercial conduct of the most governance accountability validated available alternative, rather than to the governance accountability mechanism through which the commercial entitlement the My Spot framing claims was most accurately terminated through the governance decisions whose commercial consequences the Reebok deal most commercially directly represents. The third reason is the institutional contrast the "she took my spot" communication produces. The analytical contrast between the accurate commercial accountability mechanism the governance accountability framework most precisely describes and the personal displacement framework the "she took my spot" communication most specifically expresses is the most institutionally revealing element of the entire "she took my spot" story, because it establishes the most analytically important commercial accountability communication distinction, the governance accountability transformation's most commercially concentrated individual expression has produced. The strongest counter-argument is that analyzing the "she took my spot" communication through the governance accountability framework rather than the personal emotional framework through which it was most naturally produced risks treating the emotional expression of commercial frustration as an analytical significant institutional communication whose analytical significance it was not intended to produce. That argument has genuine merit as a communicative intent caution. The counter to the counter is that the analytical significance of the "she took my spot" framing is not dependent on the communicative intent with which it was produced, but on the specific commercial and institutional claims it most precisely makes through the specific word choices it deploys. And the most analytically important element of the communication is not what Carrington intended to communicate, but what the specific "she took my spot" framing most precisely reveals about the commercial self-understanding. The governance accountability season's most commercially concentrated accountability developments have produced in the individual most directly experiencing them in their most personally concentrated form. So tell me in the comments right now, does the "she took my spot" communication reveal the most analytically significant commercial self-understanding the governance accountability story's most commercially concentrated individual expression has produced? And does the analytical contrast between the accurate commercial accountability mechanism and the personal displacement framework the "she took my spot" framing most specifically expresses represent the most institutionally revealing element of the entire "she took my spot" story? Drop your answer, because this is the commercial accountability communication question that most directly reveals how the governance accountability transformation is experienced in its most personally concentrated commercial dimension by the individual Mo.